Last week, on day 3 of the trial, we picked a jury, an all-male jury. This was 1925. Tennessee did not allow women on juries until 1951. They should be embarrassed because, after all, Massachusetts had been allowing women on juries since 1950. Good morning. Welcome to day 4 of the trial, Wednesday, July 15th, 1925. And yes, I do expect there will be time for some Q&A at the end. We're in court, so of course there's an opening prayer led by Reverend Charles Potter. Remember, this is a Reverend Potter. He signed the petition asking Judge Ralston to allow some non-fundamentalists to do the opening prayer. Reverend Potter was of the West Side Unitarian Church in New York City. This is the same Reverend Potter who'd been invited to preach at the First Methodist Church North in Dayton. The congregants protested, he agreed not to come, and the house preacher, Reverend Byrd, resigned. That Reverend Potter. Potter opens court. O thou to whom all pray and for whom are many names, lift up our hearts this morning that we may seek thy truth. May we in all things uphold the ends of justice and seek that those things may be done which will most redound in honor to thy glory and to the progress of mankind toward thy truth. Amen. This opening prayer was about 8 minutes shorter than all of the others. The author, Ray Ginger, said, quote, "Some fundamentalists would have found it less painful to yield to Darrow's argument and omit the prayer altogether." Then we get on to the important court business, namely addressing the insults of the previous day. Tom Stewart of the prosecution apologizes to Arthur Garfield Hayes for having told Hayes to shut up. Arthur Garfield Hayes says he's happy to accept the apology, so now everyone is lovey-dovey, right? Not so fast. John Neal of the defense says, "I am not at all satisfied with the apology of General Stewart, and he knows why. I've asked him to erase from the record the slurring, discourteous remark that he made in regard to another colleague of mine, Tom Stewart. When I do a thing that I feel badly about, I apologize. So long as I speak what I conceive to be the truth, I apologize to no man." Who was the other colleague of Neal's about whom Stewart spoke? It was Clarence Darrow. What was the discourteous, slurring remark that Stewart made about Darrow? Stay tuned. Now we get back to the cliffhanger that Judge Ralston left us with the day before on Tuesday. You'll remember, Judge Ralston had been preparing a ruling on the defense motion to dismiss the indictment. He had not yet issued the ruling, but he had learned that the press already was reporting on that ruling, and he was outraged. And he had appointed a 5-member committee of the press to get to the bottom of it. So now it's Wednesday, and we're going to hear what is at the bottom of this. We're going to hear from the committee. Now, the night before, on Tuesday night, this 5-member committee of journalists had assembled, and they formed a mock court. And they called before them William K. Hutchinson, the reporter who sent out the story that outraged the judge. I don't know how they knew that it was Hutchinson. So Hutchinson tells his colleagues, these 5 reporters, he overheard Darrow congratulating Bryan on getting the judge to deny the motion to dismiss the indictment, and Bryan admitted this would be the judge's decision. So the mock court decided that this reporter, Hutchinson, had done no wrong. Now we're listening to Mr. Richard Beamish, the chair of this press committee. Beamish is in court telling Judge Ralston, in essence, we know who sent out the information. He didn't obtain it improperly. There's no need for further action by the court. Judge Ralston isn't satisfied. And he says, I think the court is entitled to know how this information was had if you can furnish me that information. So for what happens next, We go back to our Knoxville friend, Rabbi Jerome Mark. Now, you'll recall last week I shared with you some of the contents of Rabbi Mark's 8-page reminiscence of the trial that he wrote in 1959. Of those 8 pages, he spent 3 pages describing this story. Rabbi Mark called this, quote, the first highlight of the trial. When the judge said that the court was entitled to know what happened, Rabbi Mark wrote, the reporter, Mr. Beamish, who had been waiting for just that sort of an opportunity, with a wink of his eyes at the press table, let go full blast. Now we're back to the transcript. Beamish, upon investigation, we find that the information came from the court. Judge Ralston. Judge Ralston, well, now wait a minute. Hadn't the mock court heard from Richardson the night before, where Richardson told the mock court that he overheard Darrow talking to Brian, and that was that? Yes, but that wasn't all that happened Tuesday night. The author, Ray Ginger, tells us that later Tuesday night, the reporter Hutchinson got a phone call from someone at the International News Service, Hutchinson's employer. The International News Service wanted to know in confidence how Hutchinson got his story. And Hutchinson told this caller, except he told a different story from what he had told his reporter colleagues, except that the caller wasn't from the International News Service, his employer. It was from one of the members of the committee who was doing a bit of investigative reporting himself. The caller from the committee had snookered Hutchinson into telling the real story. Mr. Beamish, in court before the judge, proceeds to tell what actually happened. A young man met the judge on the way to the hotel. The judge had a bundle of papers under his arm. The young man asks if that was the judge's decision on the motion to dismiss the indictment. The judge said, no, the decision is being copied by a stenographer. The young man asks, will you read that decision this afternoon? The judge says, that's my intention. The young man asks the judge, well, will you adjourn until tomorrow? And the judge replies, yes, I think so. The inference was, if the motion to quash the indictment was denied, there would be an adjournment because the trial is going to continue. If the motion was granted, the trial would be ended. There would be no adjournment. This was pure deduction by the young man who then sent the message on to the outside press. Judge Ralston, who is that young man? Beamish says, Mr. Hutchinson. Now the judge calls Hutchinson before him and says, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have done that. And he says, Mr. Hutchinson, you have anything to say for yourself? And Hutchinson says, I would be very glad to talk to Your Honor about it in chambers. I don't think I ought to do it out here. And Beamish chimes in. And he says, Judge Hutchinson is an upright, conscientious, and thoroughly honest newspaper man and has the approval of the entire corps of journalism. I think Beamish was saying to the judge, look, Hutchinson, he's a good guy. You, Judge Ralston, are going to be running for re-election next year. He was just doing his job. You screwed up, and it's not in your interest to piss him and the rest of us off. The judge says, okay, Mr. Hutchinson, in the future, just ask me what you want to know. And Rabbi Mark wrote, quote, I need not add that this literally brought down the house. We'll leave aside Rabbi Mark using the term literally when he meant figuratively, but it was a youthful indiscretion by him. So that was the end of that. So now we can get back to the important business of the trial, namely, how does Clarence Darrow feel about Tom Stewart having insulted him by calling him an agnostic? Darrow, Mr. Stewart, quote, is perfectly justified in saying that I am an agnostic, for I am, and I don't consider it an insult, but rather a compliment. to be called an agnostic. And the fact that I'm an agnostic ought not to weigh in the balance as to whether Mr. Scopes is innocent or guilty. And the judge says, Darrow's right. Let's have no reference to religious belief of any counsel in the presence of the jury. Now I'm going to read my ruling on the motion to quash the indictment. But before doing that, Judge Ralston says, first, if you gentlemen, pointing to the photographers, want to make my picture, make it now. Transcript, laughter in the courtroom. Now the judge reads his decision on the motion to dismiss the indictment. It's 8 pages of court transcript. That's about 50 minutes of time. Motion to dismiss the indictment denied. Well, it suffice to say the judge rejected all of the defense arguments. Court adjourns. Now we're midway through day 4 of the trial. The judge calls the jury back in. We hear from a juror, J.R. Thompson, because no detail is too minute for this class. Mr. Thompson, if it ain't out of order, I would like to make the unanimous request of the jury to take up the matter of some electric fans here. This heat is fearful. Judge Ralston, the county judge is the man you would have to appeal to on that. The juror, Mr. Thompson, he's a mighty nice man, and some intimation from you, Judge, would do some good. Ben McKenzie, nothing would give me greater pleasure than to have them installed, but on account of the depleted state of the Treasury, I do not believe the county can do it. Dudley Field Malone, I will buy some fans. Judge Ralston, Colonel Thompson, even the jurors are colonels apparently, I will divide my fan. Perhaps we can borrow some small fans and place them on the table. Okay, the judge then asks how the defendant pleads to the indictment, and John Neal says he pleads not guilty. Scopes doesn't say a word. Prosecution and the defense make their opening statements, and really it's nothing we haven't heard before. Now we're in the afternoon of day 4 of the trial, and something remarkable happens. We get to hear from an actual witness. Walter White was the superintendent of schools of Ray County. He was in Robinson's drugstore when all of this got started. He had called William Jennings Bryan the world's greatest man and first citizen. And White was a Republican. Bryan was a Democrat. And White signed the complaint against Scopes. So Tom Stewart begins by asking White what books or subjects Scopes taught. White says he was a science teacher. He taught chemistry, biology, and other subjects in the science course. Not so. He wasn't a biology teacher. White says that Scopes taught this book, Hunter's Biology. Remember Hunter's Civic Biology? They pulled it down from the shelf in Robinson's drugstore. So White talked to Scopes at the drugstore about his teaching Hunter's Biology, and that Scopes had done so on May 4th. He hadn't yet been arrested. So Stewart says, this is Scopes admitting to committing the offense. We think this is competent as an admission that he did so. And Clarence Darrow immediately says, it is. This is a collusive lawsuit. Darrow needed to nail that fact down. He didn't want any controversy about whether Scopes actually taught. He didn't want Scopes getting off the hook on that basis. All right? Now, Tom Stewart offers the King James Version of the Bible into evidence as an exhibit. And he says, this is what the Butler Act meant by the Bible. Let's share the screen, please. So now Arthur Garfield Hayes is off and running. What's the Bible, he says. He makes a long speech about different versions of the Bible. And he says, which version did the Tennessee legislature mean to outlaw? Or mean to refer to in the statute? And he says, the court may take judicial notice of the Bible, but the court does not take judicial notice of a fact that is at issue between the parties. Judicial notice. Not everything needs to be proven in a court. Great Barrington is a town in Massachusetts. The court can say, I can take judicial notice of that fact. We're not going to waste time proving that, okay? So Hayes says you can't take judicial notice of which Bible we're talking about because there are a lot of Bibles. So this is a matter to be proven. The prosecution has to prove which Bible is being violated in this lawsuit. He says there's nothing in the statute that shows they should be controlled in their teaching by the St. James Version. We insist the prosecution prove what Bible it is before they put it into evidence. Judge Ralston, objection overruled. Darrow now asks, well, what edition of the Bible are you introducing? And Tom Stewart says, the Holman's pronouncing edition of the Holy Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, text conformable to that of 1611, known as the Authorized or King James Version, copyright 1902. By any chance, because this is a learned group, does anybody happen to have a copy of that version of the Bible with them? All right. I thought maybe that would be the case. Don't worry, I got us covered. Here it is. Here it is. This is what I believe to be a copy of what was introduced into evidence based on my best effort years ago through Amazon. The Holman's self-pronouncing Holy Bible containing the Old and New Testaments, we're told on the cover page, translated out of the original tongues, and with the former translations diligently compared and revised. Now, wait a minute. What about these former translations? Who did the diligent comparing and revising? Darrow then asks, where can they buy a copy of this published version of the Bible? And Stewart responded, but at this point, every person in this class knows what the answer is, so I want you to say it with me. Where can you buy a copy of this Bible? At Robinson's Drugstore. Doc Robinson, remember, he's the chair of the Ray County School Board. He's selling the Bible and the biology textbook that contradicted the Bible in violation of state law. Robinson, to me, this guy is a one-man crime syndicate. Let's go to the next slide. The next prosecution witness, Howard Morgan, 14 years old, a student of John Scopes. Tom Stewart is questioning Howard Morgan. You studied this book under Mr. Scopes. It was in late April. Again, it's covered by the statute. But the book is not Hunter Civic Biology. It's a book called General Science by an author named Lewis L. Huff. Now, wait, I thought this was all about Scopes teaching from civil biology. Now we're hearing about another book. Why? Because one version of what happened is that Scopes might have made reference to evolution, not in the biology class, but in another science class where he had taught. Tom Stewart gets Howard Morgan to describe Scopes' crime. The testimony was, quote, he said that the earth was once a hot molten mass, too hot for plant or animal life to exist upon it. In the sea, the earth cooled off. There was a little germ of one-cell organism formed, and this organism kept evolving until it got to be a pretty good-sized animal, and then came on to be a land animal, and it kept evolving, and from this was man. Question, how did Scopes classify man with reference to the other animals? Howard Morgan says, the book and he both classified man along with cats and dogs, cows, horses, monkeys, lions, horses, and all that. What did he say they were? Howard, mammals. That's it for the prosecution questioning of Howard Morgan. And remember, Scopes probably never taught him any such thing. Now Darrow gets to cross-examine Howard Morgan. This becomes a touching scene in Inherit the Wind. Darrow. Now, Howard, what do you mean by classify? Well, it means classify these animals we mentioned, that men were just the same as them. In other words, Darrow. He didn't say a cat was the same as a man. Howard, no, sir. He said man had reasoning power that these animals did not. Darrow, there is some doubt about that, but that's what he said, is it? Laughter in the courtroom. Darrow then asks what makes something a mammal. Howard doesn't recall. Darrow, well, did he tell you anything else that was wicked? Ray Ginger says that the witness shot a quick glance at Scopes and grinned. The judge and attorney general, Tom Stewart, smiled. Darrow finishes with, Howard, all this stuff he taught you, it hasn't hurt you any, has it? No, sir. That's all. Laughter in the courtroom. It's a good scene in the movie. We can stop sharing. Prosecution calls another student, Harry Shelton. Very brief questioning by the prosecution, same stuff. Darrow's cross-examination, even briefer. After Harry says that Scopes taught him about all forms of life coming from a single cell, Darrow, are you a church member? Sir. Darrow, are you a church member? Yes, sir. Do you still belong? Yes, sir. You didn't leave church when he told you all forms of life began with a single cell? No, sir. Okay. The prosecution then calls Doc Robinson to get him to say what was discussed with Scopes when they called him to the drugstore. Darrow cross-examination. He gets Robinson to say that he sold Hunter's Civic Biology, the textbook. Darrow, and you were a member of the school board? Yes, sir. Laughter in the courtroom. Darrow, I think someone ought to advise you that you are not bound to answer these questions. Stewart, well, the law says teach, not sell. Laughter in the courtroom. Darrow gets Robinson to say that he sold the book for 6 or 7 years, and now Darrow is clearly having a good time. Darrow, have you noticed any mental or moral deterioration growing out of the thing? Stewart, how is that? Darrow, have you noticed any mental or moral deterioration growing out of the thing? Stewart, objection. Judge, I sustain the objection. I don't think the judge is so easily amused. The state rests. That's the end of the government case. Now Darrow and the defense are going to keep going. Without the jury present, the defense starts calling science expert witnesses. Remember, there's an issue about whether this testimony is going to be admissible, but the defense is going to put on one of the witnesses. It's a proffer, namely what the judge gets to hear the testimony and then decide whether he'll let the jury hear it. So Darrow starts to question, or next slide, please, starts to question Dr. Maynard Metcalf, a zoologist. He's a professor of zoology at Oberlin. Then he was at Johns Hopkins. The guy has high-level professional affiliations. Darrow asks Professor Metcalf, do you know any scientific man in the world who is not an evolutionist? Stewart, objection. Judge, sustained. Arthur Garfield Hayes says, we need the court to rule on this. Judge Ralston says, well, whether this law is within the police power of the state makes it relevant whether evolution is a mere guess by a few men or generally accepted by all scientists. But I don't think you can bring one witness to prove what others believe. That's what Judge Ralston says. Judge Mishkin, wrong. A big part of what scientific experts do is to say whether this school of thought or that school of thought is commonly accepted within the relevant scientific community. Arthur Garfield Hayes says our whole case depends upon proving that evolution is a reasonable scientific theory. Judge, I don't know how you can prove it reasonable by proving what some other person believes. Darrow says, okay, there are other similar questions I'm going to put to Metcalf. Is there anything in the theory of evolution in conflict with the account of creation of man in Genesis or in the Bible? Is evolution taught in all of the leading colleges of the world? The witness goes on for several minutes about evolution, mammals, teaching all of this. He talked about life existing 600 million years ago. Ray Ginger. When Metcalf spoke of life existing 600 million years earlier, spectators laughed incredulously. People whispered in disbelief. The judge gasped and took a long drink of water. They adjourned until the next morning. We come back. Now it's day 5 of the trial, July 16th. There's an opening prayer. Darrow asks a few more questions of Dr. Metcalf about evolution. Stewart objects again. Darrow continues, and he says that evidence would show what evolution is, and that any interpretation of the Bible that intelligent men could possibly make is not in conflict with any of the story of creation, while the Bible in many ways is in conflict with every known science, and there isn't a human being on earth who believes it literally. We insist that a jury cannot decide this important question, which means the jury cannot decide this important question, which means the final battleground between science and religion, without knowing both what evolution is and the interpretation of the story of creation. Stewart, in response, the act says they shall not teach that man descended from a lower order of animals according to our construction, and for these reasons the testimony would be incompetent, not capable of doing what Darrow says it should do. Let's stop the share. Now we hear from William Jennings Bryan Jr., okay, son of, who presents more argument from the state about excluding defense experts. And William Jennings Bryan Jr. says, we've reached the heart of the case. And now John Neal for the defense interrupts William Jennings Bryan Jr. to make a request of him that I bet no one ever made of his father, which was to say, can you speak a little louder? William Jennings Bryan Jr. continues, the defense wants to put on an expert to say that in his opinion, evolution doesn't contradict the Bible. This isn't a statement of fact, it's an opinion. And, quote, if a man gives a false opinion, there is no way that you can contradict him. This is wrong in so many ways. That's what expert testimony is. It's opinion testimony, and there are a slew of ways to contradict it. By another expert opinion, by showing the expert opinion is based on faulty facts, by showing the expert lacks the relevant expertise. Judge Ralston, again, will you speak a little louder? Mr. Bryan Jr. continues by referring now to Darrow's involvement in the Leopold and Loeb case. To review the bidding, to be sure we're all on the same page. This requires a moment of semi-digression. The Leopold and Loeb case, familiar to some, perhaps not to others. On May 21st, 1924, two Chicago teenagers, Nathan Leopold and Dickie Loeb, they murdered a 14-year-old named Bobby Franks. The crime was, among other things, seemingly inexplicable. These Leopold and Loeb were children of wealth. Leopold was a student at University of Chicago, heading for the Harvard Law School. Loeb was the youngest graduate ever at the University of Michigan. Their objective was to try to commit the perfect crime. They got caught. Darrow represented him. Their guilt was not in doubt. He represented them for one purpose only, to try to spare them the death penalty. There was I think they said a 26-day hearing purely on the issue of the death penalty. Darrow's 12-hour-long summation is regarded as one of the premier attacks on the death penalty ever made in a U.S. courtroom. In his summation, Darrow leaned heavily on his view of a deterministic universe that, quote, nature is strong and she is pitiless, she works in mysterious ways, and we are her victims. We have not much to do with it ourselves. And Darrow went on to talk about how Leopold was influenced by the writings of Nietzsche and Nietzsche's Superman theory. Leopold's Superman was his friend and lover and co-defendant Dickie Loeb. Quick note, no questions permitted about Nietzsche during the Q&A. My answers would be embarrassingly short. All right, Darrow succeeded. The judge declined to impose the death penalty on Leopold and Loeb. For our purposes, it's important to note that what Darrow did in 1924 in that trial was wildly unpopular in many circles, and it was fresh in the public's mind in the summer of 1925. The state referred to the Leopold and Loeb trial about a dozen times during the trial, trying to link Darrow's arguments about lack of free will to the evils of evolution. In our last class, I will explain further why I've made a point of noting this here. Now, Arthur Garfield Hayes says, whether what Scopes purportedly taught is contrary to the theory of the Bible should be a matter of evidence. Okay, this is the argument. Quote, their theory seemed to be, at the beginning, that Professor Scopes taught and that evolution teaches that man has descended from a monkey. If Professor Scopes taught that, if Professor Scopes taught that, he would not be violating this law because the orders of animals were classified by Linnaeus about 200 years ago, which was an artificial classification. In the first order, the primate order was man, monkeys, apes, and lemurs. That's the first order. To prove that man was descended from a monkey would not prove that man was descended from a lower order of animals because they are all in the same order of animals, the first order. Hayes says again, what evolution is a factual question. We need the science experts. Let's share the screen, please. Then Sue Hicks speaks for the state. Sue Hicks says, our theory is he taught it developed into different animals and came from one animal to another and passed it on up until it culminated into man himself. I would like to be given the right to challenge these men, Hicks says. They're from outside the state of Tennessee, and they come in to interpret our law of our legislature. What do they know about the Bible? They have to qualify in both the Bible and science before they can. Hayes, we want you to hear them first before you decide. Sue Hicks, why should these experts know anything more about the Bible than some of the jurors? There's one on there in the jury I will match against any of the theologians they will bring down. He knows more of the Bible than all of them do. Dudley Field Malone, how do you know? Hicks, what is the interpretation of the Bible? Some of the experts whom they brought here don't believe in God. The great majority, the leading ones, do not believe in God. They have different ideas. Malone interjects, if Your Honor, please. How does he know until he gets them on the stand what they believe? We object. Judge Ralston, I sustain the objection. You cannot assume what they believe. Hicks continues, I don't know about these foreign gentlemen, I don't know about where these foreign gentlemen come from, but I say this in defense of the state, although I think it's unnecessary. The most ignorant man of Tennessee is a highly educated, polished gentleman compared to the most ignorant man in some of our northern states, because of the fact that the ignorant man of Tennessee is a man without an opportunity, but the men in our northern states, the northern man in some of our larger northern cities, they have the opportunity without the brain. Transcript, laughter. Next slide, please. The judge says now he'll hear from Ben McKenzie. Ben McKenzie speaks. Now, perhaps he's trying to take some of the sting out of Hicks's comments about the foreign gentleman stuff. And he says, since the beginning of this lawsuit, and since I began to meet these distinguished gentlemen, the defense lawyers, I have begun to love them, every one, and it is a very easy task. In fact, it was a case of, when I met Colonel Darrow, a case of love at first sight. These other gentlemen come right on, but they wiggled around so rapidly that I could not get my love turned loose on them until I got a chance. But I love the great men. What the hell? Quick sidebar. 7 months after the trial ended, McKenzie was arrested for violating the liquor laws. Darrow offered to defend him. McKenzie declined. McKenzie now gets to the merits. There is not a thing on the face of the earth that is ambiguous about this statute. Judge Ralston asks McKenzie, is this your position, that the story of the divine creation is so clearly set forth in the Bible, in Genesis, that no reasonable minds could differ as to the method of creation, that is, that man was created complete by God? McKenzie, yes. Good for Judge Ralston. Seems like he's given it a shot here, right? Next slide, please. Judge Ralston, here's what I want to get. The act says it shall be unlawful to teach any theory that denies the divine story of the creation of man. That is one issue. Or teach instead. And Dudley Field Malone interjects, and he says, not or, and is the word. To teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Judge Ralston, and teach instead. Okay, now in order to make a case, does the state have to prove that the defendant Scopes taught a theory denying divine creation and then go further and prove that he taught that man descended from a lower order of animals? Or do you, Mr. McKenzie, claim that if you meet the second clause, teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals, by implication of law, you have met the requirement of the first clause to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation? Okay, the judge is doing some work here. Ben McKenzie, yes, that is exactly it. Namely, the second clause is sufficient. We can stop the share. McKenzie then goes on to characterize the defense argument. They want to put words in God's mouth and have him say that he issued some sort of protoplasm or soft dish rag and said, "Oh boy, if you wait around 6,000 years, I will make something of you." Transcript, laughter. Darrow interjects. Darrow interjects now to ask the question of the other lawyer. Let me ask a question. When it said, in his own image, do you think that meant the physical man, Mackenzie? I am taking the divine account. He is like unto me. Darrow, do you think it is so? Mackenzie, I say that, although I know it is awfully hard on our Maker to look like a lot of fellows who are profusely ugly, to say that he favored the master. Now, Mackenzie is on the ropes. And you know it, and you know he knows it because he's resorting to attempted humor. Making fun of the profusely ugly, some of us thought that we were all God's children. Darrow continues, when you see man, you see a picture of God. Mackenzie, like unto him and made in his image. And the reason why I believe that firmly is because the Bible teaches it. John Neal interjects, do you think if a teacher in the Tennessee schools failed to teach that man is physically like God, he would be violating the statute? Oh, I like that question. What do you think Mackenzie says? We will try that lawsuit when we get to it. Darrow comes back with another question. You spoke about it taking a good many thousand years to get man under our theory. You said there was the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, and so on. Do you think they were literal days? Mackenzie, Colonel, Darrow, we didn't have any sun until the fourth day. I believe the biblical account. When Christ was here, he was like other men, but he was in the image of God, and that's why I believe he was in the image of man. Share the screen, please. Now, at a certain point, William Jennings Bryan Sr. speaks about excluding the defendant's science witnesses. It is hard to capture Bryan's talk. He went on for about 12 pages of transcript. By my rough calculation, that's somewhere between 70 and 75 minutes. Bryan, Mr. Hayes said that before he got here, he read that I said this was to be a duel to the death between science and revealed religion. Well, my friend, if you said that this was important enough to be regarded as a duel between two great ideas or groups, I certainly will be given credit for foreseeing what I could not then know, and that is that this question is so important between religion and irreligion that even the invoking of the divine blessing upon it might seem partisan and partial. Not really sure what that means. Then he starts talking about the Butler Act. Bryan, my friends, if the people of Tennessee were to go into a state like New York, the one from which this impulse comes to resist this law, or go into any state, if they went into any state and tried to convince the people that a law they had passed ought not to be enforced, just because the people who went there didn't think it ought to have been passed, don't you think that would be resented as an impertinence? Now, what's all this talk about my friends? Right? It's like he's in a Chautauqua tent. Bryan continues, it isn't proper to bring experts in here to try to defeat the purpose of the people of this state by trying to show that this thing that they denounce and outlaw is a beautiful thing that everybody ought to believe in. What about the fact that Hunter's biology had been selected by the Board of Education? Bryan, no matter what the Board of Education has done, no matter what they put their stamp approval upon this book or not, the moment that law became a law, anything in these books contrary to that law was prohibited. And nobody knew it better than Mr. Scopes himself. It doesn't matter anything about who ordered these books. The law supersedes all boards of education, for the legislature is the supreme court on this subject from which there is no appeal. This is gibberish. Right? With very rare exceptions not applicable here, there's no such thing as a law passed by the legislature from which there is no judicial review. This is a Chautauqua speech, not serious legal argument. Then Bryan goes back to 14-year-old Howard Morgan. My friends, I have read this part of Bryan's argument several times, and I am at a loss. I am genuinely trying to give a fair representation of both sides, but what Brian said here, some might call it silly, some might call it demagoguery. Brian said, quote, "That 14-year-old boy understood the subject of evolution so much better than a distinguished lawyer who attempted to quiz him." Why? Howard Morgan had said he was taught, you may recall, there was a little germ of one cell organism formed, and this organism kept evolving until it got to be a pretty good size animal. Then it came on to be a land animal, and it kept evolving, and from this was man. So Brian says, evolution is not the growth of an individual from one cell. That is growth, but the growth of all life from one cell. Now, I want to be very clear. On this territory, I am way beyond my pay grade. I know there are students in this class who could take this and run with it, but in the simplest possible terms as I understand it, yes, we typically think of evolution as occurring over generations. But to suggest that somehow this statement of a 14-year-old on the witness stand shows he understands evolution and the lawyer did not is just malarkey, and it's way off the point. Brian goes into a discussion about Arthur Garfield Hayes, having talked about Linnaeus and the orders and all that, and Brian gets it wrong to the point that Hayes interrupts, and Brian acknowledges the error. Never mind. Brian wangles his way around this by saying, if man and monkey were in the same class, called primates, it would mean that they did not come up from the same order. It might mean that instead of one being the ancestor of the other, they were all cousins. But it does not mean that they did not come up from the lower animals, if this is the only place they could come from. And the Christian believes man came from above, but the evolutionist believes he must have come from below. Laughter in the courtroom. Ray Ginger says, Brian mistakenly thought the loud laughter was all with him. Brian then goes through a diagram from Hunter's biology. Let's pause. Who was Hunter of Hunter's civic biology? He was born in 1873 in Mamaroneck, New York. He got his BA and master's from Williams College. It's always about the Berkshires with me. He taught for 20 years at DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. He dedicated his textbook to his fellow teachers of the biology department there. It was published in 1914. 1919, he gets a PhD from NYU. He writes a bunch of biology textbooks. He taught at Carleton College for a year. He died in 1948. Now, under the heading of don't try to find bright lines between the good guys and the other guys, depending upon your point of view here, Dr. Hunter's textbook advocates for eugenics and segregation. Now remember, Brian was opposed to eugenics, which he linked to the teaching of evolution. Let me hasten to add, Clarence Darrow also was opposed to eugenics on other grounds. The version of the Hunter Civic Biology that I have has an extensive section on Darwin and his contributions to biology. Back to the trial. Let's continue to slide 9, where Brian is ridiculing Hunter's biology, and he turns to this diagram that appears in the textbook. And he points out, this diagram shows 518,000 animal species, 8,000 protozoa, 2,500 sponges, etc., etc., etc. And Brian says, they were teaching your children that man was a mammal, and so indistinguishable among the mammals that they leave him there with 3,499 other mammals. Laughter and applause. Brian, talk about putting Daniel in the lion's den. How dared these scientists put man in a little ring like that with lions and tigers and everything that is bad? Not only the evolution is possible, but the scientists possibly think of shutting man up in a little circle like that with all these animals that have an odor that extends beyond the circumference of this circle, my friends. Extended laughter. Tell me that the parents of this day have not any right to declare that children ought not to be taught this doctrine, shall not be taken down from the high plane upon which God put man, shall be detached from the throne of God, and be compelled to link their ancestors with the jungle. Tell that to these children. Why, my friend, if they believe it, they go back to scoff at the religion of their parents. Why, up in the state of New York, they are now trying to keep the schools from adjourning for 1 hour in the afternoon so that children may go to the churches to which they belong and there have instruction in the work. And they are refusing to let the school do that. We used to call that release time, right? Didn't we have? Brian then starts reading from Darwin's The Descent of Man. He's talking about a certain order of monkeys branching off into two stems, the New World and the Old World monkeys. And from the latter, the Old World monkeys, man proceeded. Brian can't resist. Not even from American monkeys, but from Old World monkeys. Laughter. The judge asks Brian if evolution theory involves Christ's virgin birth. Brian says yes, but then he goes on at length. Evolution is a doctrine that refutes not only their belief in God, but their belief in a Savior and belief in heaven, and takes from them every moral standard that the Bible gives us. It is this doctrine that gives us Nietzsche, the only great author who tried to carry this to its logical conclusion. And we have the testimony of my distinguished friend from Chicago. He's talking about Darrow, and it's not testimony when it comes from a lawyer. But he's talking about Darrow, in Darrow's speech in the Leopold and Loeb case, that 50,000 volumes have been written about Nietzsche. And we have him pleading that because Leopold read Nietzsche and adopted Nietzsche's philosophy of the Superman, that he's not responsible for the taking of human life. Again, in our last class, I will explain why we're doing this, but Darrow can't let that go. And he says, Your Honor, I want to object. There's not a word of truth in what he said. Nietzsche never taught that. And anyhow, Darrow says, there was not a word of protest of the theological colleges when a clergyman in southern Illinois killed his wife to marry someone else. Brian can't resist that bait. We do not ask to have taught in the schools any doctrine that teaches a clergyman killed his wife. Judge Ralston, of course, I cannot pass on this question of fact. Brian then engages in some back and forth with Malone about who exactly the defense intends to call. Brian objects to the defense putting on Bible experts. Brian says, when it comes to Bible experts, do they think they can bring in here? Do they think they can bring them in here to instruct the members of the jury? 11 of whom are members of the church. I submit that of the 11 members of the jury, more of the jurors are expert on the Bible than any Bible expert who does not subscribe to the true spiritual influences or spiritual discernments of what our Bible says. A voice in the audience. Amen. Brian continues. And the man may discuss the Bible all he wants, but he doesn't find out anything about the Bible until he accepts God and the Christ of whom he tells. Darrow, I hope the reporters got those amens in the record. Brian goes on for another 5 to 7 minutes about why we don't need science. Then he was done. Ray Ginger says that the applause for Brian was disappointing. It was polite. Brian then then Darrow read from what he actually said at the Leopold case, and he made a comment about Nietzsche. But the important thing is, Darrow apparently knew that Brian's speech required a response. And Darrow knew that it wasn't Darrow's place to do it. We are told that he whispered to Dudley Field Malone, I'm an agnostic and Hayes is a Jew. You've got to do it. Share the screen. Dudley Field Malone on the left. And so Dudley Field Malone, who is described as the only professing Christian on the defense team, responded. Malone's response was referred to as his duel with the truth speech. John Scopes later said that this speech was the most dramatic event I have attended in my life. Malone's reply is probably the single most underappreciated moment of the trial. Years later, Malone said it was the only extemporaneous speech he ever gave. By my estimate from the transcript, it appears he spoke about 30 or 40 minutes. And you have to keep in mind, Malone worked under William Jennings Bryan when Bryan was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. So Malone begins by needling Bryan with a joke. Probably this is the time to discuss everything that bears on the issues that have been raised in this case, because after all, whether Mr. Bryan knows it or not, he is a mammal, he is an animal, and he is man. Malone says, regarding disagreement about the meaning of text, quote, if we depended on the agreement of theologians, we would all be infidels. That's good. That's good. Mr. Bryan quoted Mr. Darwin. That theory was evolved and explained by Darwin 75 years ago. Malone says, have we learned nothing in 75 years? Here we've learned the truth of biology, we've learned the truth of anthropology, and we've learned more of archaeology. Are we to hold mankind to a literal understanding of the claim that the world is 6,000 years old because of the limited vision of men who believed the world was flat and that the earth was the center of the universe and that man is the center of the earth? Haven't we learned anything in 75 years? Are we to have our children know nothing about science except what the church says they shall know? Malone goes on, Mr. Bryan may be satisfactory to thousands of people. It is in so many ways that he is satisfactory to me, to Malone. His enthusiasm, his vigor, his fighting ability these long years for the things he thought were right. And many a time I have fought with him and for him. And when I did not think he was right, I fought just as hard against him. This is not a conflict of personages, it is a conflict of ideas. And I think this case has been developed by men of two frames of mind. We're told that Malone then looked at Bryan when he said, we have been told here that this was not a religious question. I defy anybody after Mr. Bryan's speech to believe that this was not a religious question. Mr. Bryan brought all of the foreigners into this case. Mr. Bryan had offered his services from Miami, Florida. He does not belong in Tennessee. If it be wrong for American citizens from other parts of this country to come to Tennessee to discuss issues which we believe, then Mr. Bryan has no right here either. But it was only when Mr. Darrow and I heard that Mr. Bryan had offered his name and reputation to the prosecution of this young teacher that we said, well, we will offer our services as well. Malone then spoke to the issue. The prosecution has to prove that Scopes not only taught a theory that man had descended from a lower order of animal life, but at the same time, instead of that theory, he must teach the theory which denies the story of divine creation set forth in the Bible. And we maintain we've got a right to introduce evidence from witnesses who can show there's more than one theory of creation in the Bible. Malone goes on, probably no man has done more to establish certain standards of conduct in the mechanics and world of politics than Mr. Bryan. But is that any reason that I should fall down when Mr. Bryan speaks of theology? Is he the last word on the subject of theology? These gentlemen say the Bible contains the truth. If the world of science can produce any truth or facts not in the Bible as we understand it, then destroy science, but keep your Bible, keep our Bible. And we say, keep your Bible, keep it as your consolation, keep it as your guide, but keep it where it belongs, in the world of your own conscience, in the world of your individual judgment, in the world of the Protestant conscience that I heard so much about when I was a boy. And do not try to tell an intelligent world and the intelligence of this country that these books written by men who knew none of the accepted fundamental facts of science can be put into a course of science. In other words, it says that only the Bible shall be taken as an author on the subject of evolution in a course on biology. Judge Ralston, is it not within the province of this court to determine which is true? Malone, no, but it is within the province of this court to listen to the evidence we wish to submit from science and Bible scholars that the Bible is not to be taken literally in a court of science. Judge Ralston, is it your opinion that the theory of evolution is reconcilable with the story of the divine creation as taught in the Bible? Malone, yes. He then went on, are the teachers and scientists of this country in a combination to destroy the morals of the children to whom they have dedicated their lives? Are preachers the only ones in America who care about our youth? Is the church the only source of morality in this country? Malone was now beginning to wind up. And remember, Bryan had called the trial a duel to the death. And Malone says, we have come in here for this duel. I don't know anything about dueling, Your Honor. It is against the law of God. It is against the church. It is against the law of Tennessee. But does the opposition mean by duel that our defendant shall be strapped to a board and they alone shall carry the sword? Is our weapon to be taken from us so that the duel will be entirely one-sided? That isn't my idea of a duel. Malone, there is never a duel with the truth. The truth always wins. and we are not afraid of it. The truth is no coward. The truth does not need the law. The truth does not need the forces of government. The truth does not need Mr. Bryan. The truth is imperishable, eternal, and immortal, and needs no human agency to support it. We are ready to tell the truth as we understand it, and we do not fear all the truth that they can present as facts. We are ready. We feel we stand with progress. We feel we stand with science. We feel we stand with intelligence. We feel we stand with fundamental freedom in America. We are not afraid. Where is the fear? We meet it. Where is the fear? We defy it. We ask Your Honor to admit the evidence as a matter of correct law, as a matter of sound procedure, and as a matter of justice to the defense in this case. The transcript says, profound and continued applause. The bailiff raps for order. Ray Ginger says the clapping was louder than it had been after Bryan's speech. The bailiff, a character in this play all by himself, Kelso Rice, pounded on the table with a policeman's club. The Chattanooga chief of police says to Kelso Rice, the bailiff, why he didn't applaud. And Kelso Rice says, what do you think I was doing, rapping for order? Ray Ginger says that scores of people gathered around Malone to congratulate him. H.L. Mencken was coming down the aisle. Ginger says that Malone eagerly awaited Mencken's praise. Mencken, in his inimitable fashion, said, Dudley, that was the loudest speech I ever heard. Mencken later wrote that the response to the speech was so enthusiastic that Darrow turned to Mencken and said, good God, that scoundrel will hang the jury, meaning he convinces the jury, and if the jury doesn't convict, well, that was the whole point of the trial, to get a conviction and take it up on appeal. John Scopes is said to have later told his sons, it was Malone, not Darrow, who crucified Bryan. More comments from the defense, then Tom Stewart closed for the prosecution. Next slide. Tom Stewart started with the usual. I don't believe that I came from the same cell with a monkey and the ass. What was the intention of the legislature, he asks. He says, everybody knew that the legislature meant to say in the Butler Act that the doctrine of man that descended from lower order of animals contradicted the biblical account of creation. There's no scientific testimony that's relevant. Next slide, please. Stewart says, under a correct construction of the act, if the court please, when this teacher teaches to the children of the high schools of Ray County that they're descended from a lower order of animals, he's done all that's necessary to violate the act. He has at the same time taught a theory that denies the story of the creation of man. Why? Because the act says so. Judge Ralston, you say you meet the requirements of the second clause, right? Teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. You meet the requirements of the second clause and prove it's violated by necessity, by implication of law, that meets the first clause. And Stewart says yes. I don't know about you, but that's not how I read that language when it says, and to teach instead. Arthur Garfield Hayes asks Tom Stewart, as part of the debating society that's going on now in the courtroom, Hayes, you construe the statute to be just the same as if the first part were out. That's only the second part that you have to prove, so the statute must be the same as if the first part were out. Am I right on that? He says, do you agree with me that every word or phrase in the statute should be given some meaning? Tom Stewart, no, sir. The court has a right under our rules of construction to leave out the words that do not express the intention of the legislature. Well, not in the law school I went to, not in any law school that any lawyer friend of mine has ever gone to. That's what we call statutory construction. You've got to make all of the parts make some sense in one way or another. We can stop the share. Tom Stewart went on. They say this is a battle between religion and science. If it is, I want to serve notice now in the name of the great God that I am on the side of religion. Mr. Darrow says he is an agnostic. He's the greatest criminal lawyer in America today. His courtesy is noticeable. His ability is known. And it is a shame in my mind, in the sight of a great God, that a mentality like his has strayed so far from the natural goal that it should follow. Great God, the good that a man of his ability could have done if he had aligned himself with the forces of right, instead of aligning himself with that which strikes its fangs at the very bosom of Christianity. Stuart, we are told that the great general of the Southern Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, prayed to God before each battle. And yet here we have a test by science that challenges the right to open the court with a prayer to God. You know, I'd really like to be able to say to Tom Stewart, we don't really cite Robert E. Lee as a moral authority anymore. Stewart, I say scientific investigation is nothing but a theory and will never be anything but a theory. Show me some reasonable cause to believe it is not. They cannot do it. Nothing but a theory? Arthur Garfield Hayes, give us a chance. Stewart, a chance to what? Hayes, to prove it, to show you what it is. Stewart, that charge strikes at the very vitals of civilization and of Christianity and is not entitled to a chance. Applause and laughter throughout the house. It's not entitled to a chance to prove by the word or mouth of man that man originated in the bottom of the sea. It is as absurd and as ridiculous as to say that a man might be half monkey, half man. Court adjourned. That was the end of the 5th day of the trial. George Rapelier, remember him? He was arrested for the 3rd time since the trial started, arrested for speeding. We're told that Rapelier said he was being persecuted, that he was the most careful driver in Ray County. Arthur Garfield Hayes offered to represent him. This is great, one of the country's leading trial lawyers offering to defend a speeding ticket. The city commissioners heard about this and told the presiding official to put off Rapelier's hearing for 10 days until this gang is gone. Rapelier protested and demanded his hearing be no later than Friday afternoon. The presiding officer said, "We're too busy." Day 6 of the trial, Friday, July 17th. The court day began with the bailiff asking, "Is Reverend Mark in the house? Reverend Rabbi Mark?" No, Reverend Rabbi Mark was not there. Bailiff calls another preacher who delivers a prayer. Now Judge Ralston's going to read his ruling on the motion to exclude the defense scientific experts. We're still in the slide, right? The judge said that the defense theory that the prosecutor had approved both prongs of the statute, he's not buying that. He says the second clause explains the first. They only have to prove the second. His reasoning, which I'll spare you more detail of, does not pass the test, and to my reading of it was not intelligible. The court reached the conclusion that the statute makes it unlawful to teach the theory that man descended from a lower order of animals. If the court is correct, the evidence of the experts would shed no light on this. Motion to exclude experts is granted. More lawyer argument. At one point in the back and forth, the judge said to Darrow, "Always expect this court to rule correctly." Darrow, "No, sir, we do not." Laughter. Darrow asked for the rest of the day to draft the witness statements of the science experts. The agreement was, we're just going to take the expert testimony, put it in statements, file it, it's in the record, that'll be that. And the judge starts to give Darrow a hard time about needing time to do this. And Darrow says, "I do not understand why every request of the state and every suggestion of the prosecution should meet with an endless waste of time, and a bare suggestion of anything that is perfectly competent on our part should be immediately overruled. Judge, I hope you do not mean to reflect upon the court." Darrow, "Well, Your Honor has the right to hope." Judge, "Judge, I have the right to do something else, perhaps." Darrow, all right, all right. Remember that exchange? We haven't heard the last of it. Court adjourns at 10:30 Friday morning to give the defense time to prepare the statements to return to court Monday, July 20th. H.L. Mencken wrote that now there was nothing left to do except, quote, the formal business of bumping off the defendant. On Saturday, H.L. Mencken left Dayton and left the trial. But what about the exchange between Darrow and the judge on Friday? Judge, I hope you don't mean to reflect on the court. Darrow, Your Honor has the right to hope. Would the judge hold Darrow in contempt of court? Ray Ginger reports that there was a rumor that the Chattanooga Bar Association was planning on trying to disbar Darrow from practicing in Tennessee. That Friday night, Rabbi Jerome Mark of Knoxville had planned to speak in his congregation on impressions of the Scopes trial. We are told that he was met at his synagogue by a committee of congregants who had strong objections. After a meeting, Rabbi Mark appeared late before the congregation and said he had decided to postpone his talk until after Sunday, when the synagogue membership would vote on whether they wished to hear it. What happened over the weekend? A New York Times reporter, still in Dayton, reported what was called a lesser conspiracy that the defense may call to the stand William Jennings Bryan. When did this idea first materialize? It is hard to say exactly. Arthur Garfield Hayes later said this was unpremeditated, essentially spur of the moment idea. But in context, 2 years earlier, in July 1923, Clarence Darrow had published in the Chicago Tribune a list of 55 questions about Genesis that he invited William Jennings Bryan to answer. We're told that after court on Thursday, the day before, Darrow had said to Reverend Potter, our New York Unitarian friend, that Darrow intended to put the greatest Bible expert in the world on the stand, Bryan. He told Potter to keep it to himself, but that Darrow was going to need Potter's help. Now it's Sunday night, July 19th. Darrow meets with Curtly Mather, one of the people lined up to be a science expert. Mather was the chair of the geology department at Harvard and an ardent Baptist. Mather had said to Darrow that he was concerned about the effect of the trial on religion, that people would be misled into thinking they had to choose between religion and science. So Clarence Darrow and Arthur Garfield Hayes sit Curtly Mather down, and they told him, you are Bryan, and you are going to answer our questions as you think Bryan would. Ray Ginger says that for 2 hours they had a hilarious time. Mather asked how they intended to get Bryan to take the stand, and they responded, we have our ways. How did they do it? And what happened when they did? Almost 100 years later, people are still talking about it, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. With that, from my looking, we're in great shape for some Q&A, and I'd be happy to hear whatever you may. We've got something coming in over the chat. Great, Judith.
Catherine Kidd asks, how common were expert witnesses in trials in 1925?
Kate Kidd. You remember I said if you want an intellectual, take a class with Kate Kidd. How common was scientific expert testimony in trials in 1925? I don't know. What I can't speak to how common compared to 100 years later. What we know is the rules of evidence contemplated that kind of testimony. There was no suggestion that this kind of thing just isn't done. Beyond that, affiant saith not. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ron.
This is a very minor detail, but both the state attorney general and Uncle Garfield Hayes, as I recall, refer to the King James Bible as the Saint James Bible. And as a Southerner, it just seems like, to me, like I'm calling 1 Corinthians 1 Corinthians or something like that, whatever he said. Did anyone ever raise that question? Misnaming the King James Bible? King James was no saint.
So that everybody on Zoom can hear, Ron Strickland here in the room is picking up on that there was reference made to the King James Bible, and then apparently in something that I read, it's referred to by somebody else as a St. James version, and to the ear of one who knows something about the Bible and various versions of the Bible, those two descriptions can't be reconciled. There's certainly nothing that I found certainly not in the transcript or even in commentary, that anybody picked up on that. What the defense did tap dance all over about was the idea that there are hundreds of versions of the Bible, and believe it or not, there are actually pieces of lawyer argument that I'm not reading to you word for word in the class. I think it might have been Darrow at one point who said, we got Protestants and Catholics with different versions arguing with each other. We got Protestants arguing with each other. So the larger point certainly was made, but that's an interesting one. That'll go on my list to follow up on. Judith, another on the chat.
Kenneth Ross asks, was Scopes aware that Darrow was seeking a conviction as opposed to seeking an acquittal? And if not, Darrow was unethical in his representation of a defendant by putting forth a fake defense meant to undermine his client's best interest.
So the question is, was Scopes aware that Darrow effectively was angling for a conviction? And if he wasn't, was that somehow a breach of Darrow's professional ethics responsibility to Scopes? I'm quite confident from everything I've read from Scopes' his own memoir and other things that he said. Scopes knew the game plan from the beginning. The whole idea, this was not a trial so much of the prosecution trying to convict Scopes. This was about the ACLU and Darrow and the defense team trying to convict the statute, right? They're trying to invalidate the statute. That was the game plan from the beginning. Now we have a soundtrack to the class. Not only was Scopes aware of that, but he was emphatically on board with that. And he took this on as a mission to do his part to invalidate what he and Darrow and the others in the ACLU thought was an invalid law. Stephen.
This character Malone is so appealing. I'm wondering, did any part of his speech or his testimony wind up in play?
The question is, did any part of Dudley Field Malone's duel with the truth speech wind up in the play? I don't, not that I recall. I have carefully tracked, the transcript and the play script, and so the Darrow stuff is sitting right there. But I don't recall that anything from Duel with the Truth wound up. Interesting that it didn't. It certainly was of a high order of eloquence, as evidenced by the reaction in the room, and perhaps those of you watching on Zoom, and the reaction in the courtroom, that got a lot of attention. But I don't recall. But now my assistant and I, when we set out to watch Inherit the Wind for the 43rd time, in anticipation of week number 5, we'll have something else to keep in mind. Judith.
Kyle asks, Genesis in the Old Testament, but the experts who are discussing, debating were Christian. Was there any consideration of a rabbinical expert to be called to the stand?
The question is, the discussion was among Christian, quote, experts on the Bible. Was there any discussion about a Jewish expert on the Hebrew Bible? Well, that's what Rabbi Herman Rosenwasser was trying to do. You may recall, I think it might have been in the first lecture, we talked about Rabbi Rosenwasser coming from San Francisco. This is the guy who spoke or read 13 different languages, including Chaldaic. His thesis was to understand, to properly interpret the King James Bible, one would have to know the Hebrew from whence it came. And so Rabbi Rosenwasser came in and said, I can do this translation for you, the defense team, in a way that serves the defense argument that there's nothing inconsistent about the biblical story of creation with evolution. Rosenwasser didn't make it to the witness stand. He was one of those who submitted a written statement, but it was of no effect in the trial.
Kate says again, it seems like the trial got off track from the main concern of academic freedom, free speech, and majoritarian control of education. Given all the additional issues, did that muddy the waters for an appeal?
Well, so Kate Kidd's question is, it seemed like the trial went off track from the issues of freedom of speech, academic freedom. And I think, Kate, the answer to that is that was the track that the ACLU had conceived for the case from the beginning. That was because that was central to its mission at that time. Remember, having shifted from a focus on World War I pacifists and the like to now the rights of teachers and union rights. So the ACLU very much wanted to try the case as being about freedom of speech and academic inquiry, and their reluctance to have Darrow as part of the defense team was because they saw it coming, that Darrow did not conceive of the trial in that fashion. He saw this as a forum to have it out with the religious views that were behind the anti-evolution movement. So off the track, perhaps from the ACLU perspective, but they could not have kidded themselves into thinking that that was the track that it was going to stay on, or at least stay on exclusively. That wasn't Darrow's idea, and it wasn't executed that way. I think also, however, the transcript's got plenty of stuff about, teachers need to be able to do what they need to do within certain boundaries. Kate refers to the business about the majoritarian argument that Brian and others made, which is, hey, the majority calls the shots. If parents don't want this stuff taught in the schools, and that's what the legislature says, end of discussion. And the response to that, of course, from the ACLU and Darrow and the like is not end of discussion. There are all kinds of things that we don't let the majority or shouldn't let the majority get away with because we have a constitution that this is all subject to.
Another question from Kate. Why do you think Inherit the Wind portrayed the audience as very pro-Brian?
So Kate asks, why does Inherit the Wind portray the audience, meaning in the people in the courtroom, as being very pro-Brian? I say, Judge Mishkin, I object, Kate. You are inviting me to step on my own lines, which are all geared up and ready to go for the 5th class, which is entirely about the phenomenon of Inherit the Wind, how it came to be written and produced, and the play, and leading to the movie. And then, what of it? How did it become a phenomenon that's played so much a part of shaping the American understanding of the Scopes trial? So I'm going to defer answering that until we do the deep dive into Inherit the Wind, because the depiction of the people who were sitting in the courtroom, and the depiction of the town of Dayton, known as Hillsborough in Inherit the Wind, is very much a subject of controversy and debate. Anything else? Naomi.
Would you like to compare Darrow or not, anything that went on in court to what the White House said to Harvard on Friday?
Well, the question is whether I would like to compare what Darrow said to the court with what the White House sent to Harvard on Friday. Lecture 6, my closing sermon, will address the larger question of that. I'll step on my own lines enough to say, as I've said to many of you informally, one of the reasons I felt strongly about teaching this class of the first time in 2019, and even more so this time, is if you share my view of the world, and I seriously do not presume to know what anybody taking this class feels one way or the other, but if you share my view of the world, then we lost this case in 1925, and we are losing it in one fashion or another every day now. Details to follow. Unless there are any other questions, I am happy to say court is adjourned. Thank you all for being here. Next Tuesday, 9:30. Thank you.